Welcome back to another episode, all. Throughout this episode, I'm going to talk about disability and say, is disability even a real or natural thing? Let's get started. Andrew Sims says, I quote, "Disease or illness is a social construct." A philosopher who was deeply interested in health and illness, Peter Sedgwick wrote, "All departments of nature below the level of mankind are exempt both from disease and from treatment, until man intervenes with his own human classifications of disease and treatment. The blight that strikes at corn or at potatoes is a human invention. For if man wished to cultivate parasites rather than potatoes or corn, there would be no blight, but simply the necessary foddering of the parasite crop. Thus, because we want to grow potatoes, we categorize potato blight as disease of potatoes." End of quote. The medical model of disability and the social model of disability are often seen as two extremes, and how people look at disability often lies somewhere in between. The medical model is based on the fundamental assumptions that there is only one right way to be, and that all problems are because of impairments and internal problems. The medical model is greatly reductionist, and people usually take it as a default view without even questioning or reflecting on it. The medical model is deeply rooted in the pathology paradigm and capitalism. The social model, on the other hand, views disabled as a verb and the opposite of enabled. The social model is not so reductionist as it can acknowledge the socio-economic factors and environmental barriers created by society. The only common denominator among disorders is not statistical deviation, but is social deviation. The disablement is not caused by an impairment, but by society's failure to accommodate an impairment. Everyone has difficulties. No one can do everything. Those who are not seen as disabled are not so, because all their needs and impairments disabling them participating in society have been accommodated for by the design and shaping of society. There are countless ways of embodiment of humans, and all humans are on the human spectrum. Nick Walker pointed out, just because we are more likely to statistically select a Chinese person than an Irish person, that does not mean the Chinese are more normal or healthy than the Irish. In the same sense, just because we are more likely to randomly select a certain embodiment than another, doesn't mean the selected one is healthier and better. Jerry Bergman says, I quote, "At best, one could try to make judgments relative to the superiority of one specific trait compared to another trait. This is most easily achieved in the case of a mutation. A person who had a mutation that caused hemophilia could be considered inferior compared to the person who had a normal factor VIII gene. This method considers only one gene, and a person without the genetic defect for hemophilia will be genetically inferior in some other way because mutations or genes that produce inferior traits exist in all humans." End of quote. If all embodiments contain genes that produce inferior traits, including genes that increase susceptibility to disease, why are only some of these genes considered disabled and impaired? Nick Walker wrote, I quote, "It's a cultural value judgment." For example, related to that written above by Jerry Bergman, if the sickle cell mutation protects people from malaria infections, why aren't people without the sickle cell mutation considered genetically disordered when they have enhanced susceptibility to malaria infection? Because not having the sickle cell mutation does not cause a social deviation, just like baldness is not a social deviation. Psychologist Howard Gardner warned, I quote, "With the coming of age of genetics, the danger magnifies. Beyond doubt, we will discover genes that are important for reading alphabetic scripts, and there is already evidence that a small set of genes may be related to reading problems. As with the brain evidence, Such information can be helpful for early intervention, but it could easily be used for stigmatizing purposes. Indeed, it might become relevant for marriage prospects, holding a job, securing insurance, or even eugenic purposes. And especially in our interventionist society, individuals with a genetic predisposition for reading problems will look into various kinds of genetic engineering or therapy. It is possible that such interventions will work and have no negative side effects, but it is perhaps more likely that they will have unanticipated effects, and we might want to consider which valued human abilities, for example, spatial or pattern recognition skills, might be placed at risk were we to target our interventions specifically at reading disorders. End of quote. What about embodiments in culturally valued changes generation after generation, meaning which embodiments are valued and judged as healthy, changes each generation now that health is a political discourse, not scientific. The LGBTQ were not valued and were stigmatized before the start of the 21st century. But as recent generations have begun to value and accept the LGBTQ as participants of society, they are no longer seen as mentally ill or impaired. As social context has changed during the 21st century, some people have stopped viewing neurominorities and variation in neurocognitive functioning as disorders and began seeing them as differences. Steve Silverman's book Neurotribes has greatly contributed towards this change of perspective. As psychiatry has medicalized more and more ordinary human experiences, more and more people have been diagnosed with so-called disorders. As more social media platforms have risen, more disabled people have kept debunking myths and exposing lies by abled people. One of the biggest assumptions disabled people combat is the assumption they need to be fixed because they can't possibly enjoy life with such embodiments. As neurominorities have kept sharing, they don't want to be cured and express the moments they enjoy in life. They often find themselves accused of romanticizing disorders. However, the truth is, the majority romanticizes the ideology of normal people. The romanticism of normal and demonization of disabled people happened during the eugenics movement by social policy. Raphael Baer says, I quote, "The political scientist Benedict Anderson described nations as imagined communities, which is to say their existence, real enough in the minds of those who feel they belong in one, is a narrative construct. It is a myth that people tell themselves, assembled from bits of common economic interest, shared religion, ethnicity, and remembered history. The myths stick and evolve into identities when they have sufficient resonance with a critical mass of people." End of quote. Where Benedict Anderson talks about myths evolving into identities, that is exactly what's happened to embodiment. I'm normal. Normal was made an identity as soon as health was redefined by social policy in the eugenics movement. The term abled wasn't in use until 1940 in the eugenics movement, 1 century after the ideology of normal people by Adolf Quetelet. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, abled means, I quote, "having a full range of physical or mental abilities, not disabled," close quote. Not one human fits the definition of having a full range of physical and mental abilities, which is why people are relying on other people in so many ways. Today, we have science articles mentioning disabled community. The world has been divided by a political movement into the abled community and the disabled community, a dichotomy of abled versus disabled, a logical fallacy used in political discourse, not science. The truth is, abled and disabled are not aspects of a person's embodiment. Every embodiment is either enabled, or disabled by social and political context. Benedict Anderson, describing nations as imagined communities, matches Anthony D. Mello's claim that humans are lost in their ideas, ideals, and minds. This also matches Albert Einstein's insight that everything begins within the imagination. I quote, "Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination embraces the entire world, stimulates progression, and gives birth to evolution." End of quote. I don't believe the abled community and the disabled community are even genuinely real. As Benedict said, if we feel we belong in one of them, we believe them in our minds. Once the eugenics movement divided the world into the normal community and the abnormal community, the world's perspective about health and disability entirely changed, splitting into an us versus them mentality of who is superior and who is inferior. I believe in the natural world and that nature knows better than humans. The more we learn, the biggest lesson we'll learn is just how little humans know. Nature did not create communities, countries, races, ethnicities, etc. I see humanity as part of one community called nature. If scientists are right about how the earth and how stars are created, we are originally just the offspring of filth, dirt, and rock from outer space. Nature never said things like, "Hey, land, your name is Germany. Hey, you're called the North Sea. You, island over there. I can't be bothered to think at the minute, so I'll just call you island." All countries and continents were made by humans, not nature. In ancient times, we were already tribal, with each tribe having their own land. Just like other animals, we competed for food and land before we became civilizations. As cultural evolution occurred, political borders were made for each country. A recent example is from 2019. In 2019, Brexit became a political vote of Britain exiting the European Union. In 2020, Britain voted to leave Europe, changing the borders of the continent. To expand, Scotland didn't want to leave Europe. Despite this, Scotland has been removed from the EU, along with the rest of Britain. Scotland's formal relationship with Europe is now determined by the agreements between the UK government and the European Union, the withdrawal agreement, and the trade and cooperation agreement. If Scotland was not removed from Europe, Brexit would have turned the UK from one country into two countries, through politics creating another border. We can still see the tribal nature in human beings through political discourse producing communities and cultural diversity. Just like politics have divided one world into multiple countries, Francis Galton's ideology has put borders between humanity's social equality by dividing the population into different classes of social merit. Due to cultural evolution and social change, social merit changes, then what is considered a disorder changes. The fact that what is considered a disorder is in direct correlation with cultural evolution, cultural diversity, the mythological norm, and political votes, adds further evidence that health was twisted and redefined by the political eugenics movement. The more scrutiny you put towards what is considered a healthy human by today's standards, it becomes more and more clear that health is no longer scientific discourse, but is political discourse. If health was still scientific, why does there need to be political votes about medical treatments as acceptable or unacceptable? And how is it possible for politics to change objective scientific facts if the science behind disability is legitimate science and not cultural prejudice? Dr. Gaber Mate writes, I quote, "The genetic argument is used to justify social inequalities and injustices that are otherwise hard to defend. Much like junk sciences of the past, phrenology, eugenics, and so on, it serves a deeply conservative function. If phenomena like addiction and mental distress are determined by mostly biological heredity, we are spared from having to look at how our social environment supports or does not support the parents of young children, and that how social attitudes, prejudices, and policies burden, stress, and exclude segments of the population, thereby increasing their propensity for suffering. End of quote. As numerous neurodiversity advocates have pointed out, we live in a world not designed to suit disabled people, which is what disables them. However, I think they were right at first, but during the 21st century, the world has been excessively designed to enhance capitalism at the cost of human well-being. Before the end of the 20th century, our species were not experiencing even half of the disorders we are seeing today. Diagnosis rates were nowhere near the rates we see today. In today's world, there's less time to spend with family, more work hours for all age groups, more stress and anxiety due to financial crisis, the majority experience, increasing addiction due to desperation for relief. The list of avoidable causes of health issues is endless, and is only expanding as technology is advancing and being abused. Remember that this all began with Francis Galton applying statistics to humans and society, and that he genuinely believed poverty is inherited genetically. His normal distribution curve, divided into quartiles, also applied to poverty. Those on the enhanced side are the rich and wealthy. Those on the lower end are the so-called inferior to profiteer-on, and the majority between the two extremes are financially disadvantaged, serving the rich and providing money for the so-called inferior. The whole concept of normal puts the vast majority of the world's population at risk of inharmonious relationships between their embodiment and environment, resulting in sickness and disease. The concept of normal feeds discriminatory and oppressive practices, as people can't profiteer off of a group of people without oppressing and hindering them. Dr. Damian Milton writes, I quote, "Standardized assessments, typically standardized on white neurotypical populations, continue to feed discriminatory and oppressive practices that limit autistic people's opportunities in accessing the same learning opportunities as non-autistic peers. Normative assessments cannot measure neurodivergence. Tools that rate the autistic or learning disabled child's communication skills as high, low functioning, or mild, moderate, severe do not tell us what the person needs. They just indicate how far off this person is from the imaginary, perfectly average neurotypical equivalent. This sets the neurodivergent person up to be offered harmful behavioral interventions to try to remediate this perceived gap until the autistic life world being invaded by a never-ending tide of interventions that try to eradicate autistic styles of diversity." End of quote. All embodiments fit the definitions of disabled. I see a big ego in people as they believe they are independent. No one's independent, to be honest. Everyone is something called interdependent. Interdependence is not a weakness. It takes more courage to put your needs into the hands of another than keeping them to yourselves. There appears to be a cultural belief in independence and a disbelief that we are interdependent. We depend on each other in order to succeed in life and flourish. No one is an isolated, independent human. All people classified as disabled are seen as abnormal. If we are to describe disabled people as abnormal, it becomes necessary to define the characteristics of normal people, which is impossible as it is subjective. The dictionary gives disability the definition, I quote, a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition that impairs, interferes with, or limits a person's ability to engage in certain tasks or actions or participate in typical daily activities and interactions. Close quote. The important term there is typical, as typical is associated with normal. By not being able to define normal day-to-day activities, as they vary due to cultural diversity, typical immediately disqualifies the definition as objective, meaning it is not scientific, but a social narrative, something in your imagination. Today, the term disabled can be used as a verb, noun, or adjective. There is no objective definition of disabled, meaning today's dominant perspective is pseudoscience, invalid and illegitimate. From my view, we need to come up with a valid way to discern the difference between uncommon variations and actual disease, disorder, disability. To do this will require criteria that can help us differentiate an uncommon difference from an uncommon variation or actual diseases. I would say any uncommon variation that greatly reduces the human lifespan, like sickle cell anemia, would qualify as a disease and not just an uncommon variation. After all, the existence of diseases and forms of pathology can't be denied, but we need to improve how we discern them. I would say the biggest clue to discern health problems is relational. Health is a harmonious relationship, as Mr. Wells said. So anything that disturbs the relationship of our own embodiment can qualify as unhealthy. Overall, the concept of disability is obscured by the genetic fundamentalism excuse and the idea that a disabled person is a broken machine. The World Health Organization is entirely wrong about disability, which is why they have so many false beliefs, which are debunked by neurodivergent researchers. No one is disabled permanently. I'll take my autism as an example. If social deficits are a disability I carry everywhere with me, I should have a difficulty socializing with everyone. But that's not the case. The only people I struggle to socialize with are people who don't try to understand me. I communicate fine with people who intend to understand me and tolerate my differences. So concerning socializing, the difficulty is caused by the lack of effort of other people not trying to understand me. We always hear the World Health Organization claim autism is genetic, even though they haven't found an autism gene. The World Health Organization just automatically assumes everything we suffer from is genetic, even without any evidence. Dr. Gerber writes again, I quote, what then of conditions widely believed to be brain diseases, largely rooted in genetics, such as the group of diverse behaviors and thought patterns called schizophrenia, marked often as psychosis, delusions, and hallucinations? The science is clear and, again, belies popular prejudice. No schizophrenia gene has ever been found, or, more accurately, claims of its discovery have had to be serially retracted. Broad surveys have found that most of only about 4% of the risk can be attributed to a wide variety of genes, none of them specific to this condition, as they are also seen in cases of ADHD or autism. End of quote. Eradicating disability removes a vibrant part of our culture and society. Disabled people will never go away, because new genetic mutations will lead to new disabilities. It is fruitless to attempt to rid the world of disabled people with a secondary eugenics movement, because it is never going to happen. Even if people who have accidents can restore their spinal function so they can walk and move again independently, Some types of disabilities will always exist. As such, instead of trying to get rid of an entire group of people, we should be working to find ways to accommodate our existence in a society that often says we do not deserve to be here. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Please share with me your views about disability in the comments section. And please subscribe. Thank you.